There are secrets that, once spoken aloud, open the door to hope, but there are also secrets that become blades the moment they surface, cutting through the last remaining illusions. Shanice stepped into that moment with a trembling heart, carrying a fragile joy she believed would be enough to soften even the coldest response. But she had no idea that the news of the baby would not simply reach Ted. It would strike the darkest corner of him, where fear, selfishness, and the instinct to deny had been waiting for a very long time. From that moment on, a family already cracked beneath the surface began to shake violently. A woman was pushed to the edge of humiliation. A man destroyed the image of himself with his own hands. And two daughters, who thought they already understood their father, were about to witness the cruelest version of him. The most terrifying part was not that a pregnancy was rejected, but that this rejection would drag out other truths with it, leaving no one a way back. Shanice had once believed that no matter how complicated, distant, and emotionally guarded Ted was, somewhere deep inside him there was still enough humanity left for him not to turn his back on a child. She had prepared herself for confusion, for difficult questions, even for heavy silence. But she had never prepared herself for the moment Ted looked at her as if everything she had brought him was nothing more than a trap. There was not even a flicker of joy in his eyes, no responsibility, no concern for the woman standing in front of him with news that would change her life forever. Ted almost immediately denied the baby, with a chill so brutal that Shanice no longer felt pain in the ordinary way. She was stunned, not simply because he doubted her, but because she realized that this man had chosen to destroy her dignity before allowing himself to be tied to anything he could not control. For Ted, that reaction did not come entirely from suspicion. It came from fear. He feared losing control, feared that a new child would disrupt the life he had carefully arranged to suit himself, feared what Eva and Kat would think, feared that the secrets of his past would be dragged into the light the moment this pregnancy appeared as living proof. Ted was not unaware of how deeply he had wounded Shanice. It was precisely because he understood that he became even crueler, because in his mind, if he denied it quickly enough, firmly enough, coldly enough, the truth could be strangled before it had a chance to grow. He told himself he was protecting stability. In reality, he was behaving like a coward, willing to throw a woman into the abyss just to keep his own image intact. Shanice left that confrontation no longer the woman who had entered it with hope shining in her eyes. What remained in her was shame, fury, and a cold, unbearable confusion. The baby in her womb suddenly became the center of the most painful choices of her life. Keeping the child would mean stepping into a long war, facing suspicion, whispers, and almost certain loneliness. But giving up the pregnancy would be another kind of loss, a wound that would never fully heal. Because she would know she had allowed Ted's cruelty to determine the fate of a life she once considered miraculous. She no longer had the luxury of being fragile, yet she was not calm enough to become strong overnight. Shanice began living in a state of division, half wanting to keep the child as a way of holding on to the last piece of her dignity, half wanting to disappear from everything so she would never again have to see the face of the man who had turned her joy into a merciless trial. The truth did not remain hidden for long. When Eva found out, Her anger ignited almost instantly, but beneath the anger was something even more devastating, a sense of collapse. Eva had already carried quiet distance inside her toward Ted. She was used to seeing in him a hardness that left no room to breathe. But Ted's decision to reject an unborn child and throw Shanice into humiliation was something else entirely. To Eva, this was no longer a thoughtless mistake. It was the exposure of the true nature of a man who always needed to control everything and was willing to crush anyone who became inconvenient to him. Her fury was not only about what he had done now, but about every time she had forced herself to believe Ted still had limits, that he could be harsh without being heartless. Now all of those excuses had collapsed. Kat reacted differently from Eva, but no less intensely. For Kat, the greatest shock was not only that Shanice had been treated so unfairly, but that the person responsible was her own father, the man she had once wanted to trust, the man she had tried to defend in her heart every time the family began to fracture. At first, Kat tried to hold on to the possibility that Ted was simply panicking, that perhaps he had reacted badly in a moment of emotional chaos. But the more she saw Shanice drowning in pain, the more she relived Ted's icy response. The more she understood that this was not a momentary lapse. It was a conscious choice. And that realization pushed her into the most violent inner conflict of her life. On one side was the instinct of a daughter who still wanted to preserve the image of her father. On the other was a growing disgust as she was forced to admit that Ted might be far crueler than she had ever imagined. The difference between Eva and Kat's reactions quickly created another wave of collision. Eva wanted everything brought into the light. She wanted Shanice to stop staying silent. She wanted Ted to pay with his reputation and with the respect he had once commanded from those around him. Kat, meanwhile, was more torn, but because she was torn, her pain became quieter and perhaps even more dangerous. She felt as if her family was standing on rotten ground, and that just one more step would make everything cave in. Yet Ted still failed to grasp the severity of what he had done. He kept clinging to the argument that he had a right to doubt, a right to protect his life from a disruption that felt too large to bear. The more he justified himself, the more furious Eva became, the colder he remained. The more numb Kat grew with disappointment. Meanwhile, Shanice began to understand that she could not wait for compassion from Ted. The long nights she spent alone began to change her. The pain that first crushed her slowly transformed into a bitter clarity. She realized that if she continued to let Ted control the rhythm of this crisis, she would lose everything. The baby, her dignity, even her ability to face herself. But choosing to rise did not make anything easier. It only made her suffer in a more deliberate way. She had to face the truth that she was carrying a child whose father did not want to claim it. She had to accept that from now on, every decision she made would carry irreversible consequences. That was what turned Shanice into the center of a storm no one could control, because when a woman is pushed to the wall, the most dangerous thing is not her tears, but the moment she's no longer afraid of losing anything. Ted began to feel the fractures spreading around him. Eva no longer looked at him with a daughter's eyes. Kat no longer defended him without question. Every room in the house became suffocating with an invisible judgment he could not silence. And what unsettled Ted most was the growing realization that he might have miscalculated. He had believed that denying the pregnancy would be enough to cut off the threat. But in truth, that denial became the very spark that ignited every tension that had already been smoldering inside the family. His indifference protected nothing. It only exposed the man he had spent so long trying to hide. And then the greatest shock of all arrived, not through a new secret, but through the transformation of the people closest to Ted. Eva no longer wanted to save the family image. Kat no longer had the strength to pretend everything would eventually be fine. Shanice was no longer the woman waiting to be acknowledged, but the one holding a truth capable of destroying the moral foundation Ted was standing on. The pregnancy he had dismissed as an inconvenience now became the symbol of everything he could no longer control, and in that very moment, the real tragedy began. Not because a child might be born into chaos, but because from that point on, none of them could return to who they once were. Shanice had lost her faith. Eva had lost her respect. Kat had lost her emotional anchor. And Ted, the man who thought he was only denying a responsibility, had in fact denied himself the right to still be seen by his daughters as a real father.